all of you guys for coming, and especially thanks to these two incredible panelists and discussants today. We're truly a privilege to have you both, to have you both here with us. Sam has provided really remarkable leadership. Sam, you've been here for a year, a little longer. Sam came to us from the Wharton School, as many of you know, and really what he has accomplished in a year at this school, from the time we met, a little bit over a year ago, I think we met in the summertime, is really remarkable because, as you know, those of you who work at the school or teach in the school, the Institute, it really is the nation and the world's premier real estate program. And I was so honored when former President John Sexton asked me to become part of the NYU community. NYU and the University of Toronto had a long history of joint activities, including the CUSP Center. And John at that point asked me where I'd like to be at NYU. He said, you know, Richard, you're kind of a square peg in a round hole anyway. And I said I would very much like to be at the Shack Institute because as an urbanist, I know a lot about urban policy and urban development, but I know very little about real estate. And the education I've received in the Institute has been really remarkable. The reason we're doing this is well, we think it's the most important issue of our time, this issue of inclusive growth and inclusive prosperity. And certainly, with the election and with Republicans' control of both houses of Congress and the current president, it's become less likely that the federal government will solve urban problems. And so it's up to local communities, local stakeholders, local community groups, local corporations, what we call anchor institutions. That can be a large company like Prudential, a real estate developer like Jody's company, Eden's, a large university like NYU, a medical complex, a large organization. So these anchor institutions and local actors become incredibly important. And with my great friend and colleague, Stephen Pedigo, who's right there, who runs the Urban Lab, we recruited Stephen where he was working with a guy named Michael Porter. You may have heard of him at Harvard Business School, at the Institute for Competitive Inner Cities. We brought him here to NYU to start the Urban Lab. And my other colleague, Aria Bendix, who's sitting near Stephen, who worked with me previously as an editorial fellow at The Atlantic, we drafted a report. And that's what is sort of the reason behind all of this. We drafted a report on anchors and inclusive prosperity. Look, I tell everyone about my books. If you buy my books, you'll have the best month of sleeping you'll ever have. This is short and to the point. And it's on our website for the lab. We wrote up a little briefer version for City Lab at the Atlantic, which you could just Google in either one. We called it The Case for Inclusive Prosperity. I think at City Lab we called it Why Urban Anchors Are Important to Inclusive Prosperity. But the idea being that in this day and age, these anchor institutions are really critical. And here's what happened. When I went out at book tour, Jody was kind enough to host the initial event at the Union Market, which we'll get to in a moment. Someone at NYU said, when they heard me here initially, I sounded awful gloomy and doomy. And they said, they heard me about 2 months later at an event in New York City, uptown, and they said I sounded far more optimistic. And it took me a long time to figure out why. And then I realized it had to be because I was going to community around the United States and Canada, around the world, Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. And I could go on. I mean, it just goes on. The list goes on. And everywhere I went, I encountered someone who ran an anchor institution who told me this. You know, Richard, I'm the president of a large university. We employ a lot of people. We have a technology incubator. We've driven development. But I'm part of the problem. Our university, as an anchor institution, has not done enough to address the divide that you write about. I happen to run a local real estate firm, and we've been working with the local sports organization, and we've been developing an arena district, and it's been fantastic in what we've done. But I feel like I've contributed to this. And this happened in a medical center. The head of a medical center saying, you know, her medical center had given so much to their community, but it was paying high salaries to doctors and medical professionals and providing them the ability to move back to the city, but the divide in her city was getting bigger. And I think, and one last comment before we turn to the panelists, and what really gave me tremendous hope, you know, about this. Last week I presented to the International Conference for Economic Developers, This is 2,000 economic developers from around the world. These are the people who make competitive, successful, job-generating, innovative communities, and a group I've known for a long time. And I was frankly quite nervous. I don't often get nervous. You can see I'm not shaking today, but I was frankly quite nervous because I had to bring them a message which was not all boostery and cheery and gleeful. I had to say to them that we were part of the problem, our community focused on economic development at the expense of equity, that our cities had become winner-take-all urbanism, that they had become divided. And Jody, frankly, I talked about some of the things we raised in our essay for the Harvard Business Review, why we all needed to commit to inclusive prosperity. And as I talked about that, the room exploded into applause. It was the only applause line I got. 2,000 economic developers. And after that meeting, the person who gave me my first speech ever, he was an economic developer in Toledo. He's now moved on to many other communities. He's sort of the dean, if you will, if you can have a dean of economic development. He said, we too have been part of the problem. Our profession is called economic development, but we've talked only about economic growth and job growth and population growth. What you're talking about brings us back to our roots of economic development, which is to really develop our communities, we have to raise all boats. We have to make sure everyone can participate in our economies, that everyone has a good job and affordable housing, that equity and growth go together as part of what economic development truly is. That's why I think I've become incredibly optimistic. So we have two panelists who know this from the ground level, who've done it for a long time. Jody McLean is a dear friend. I've known Jody for a decade now. We've worked together. She's been kind enough to invite us and my team to work together on, she has many developments, but on one of her signature developments, the Union Market in Washington, D.C. She's the CEO of Edens, a fabulous real estate organization, managing more than $6 billion in assets. And she has become really the spokesperson, I believe, in the real estate community for making better, stronger communities that are more inclusive. And that is something, if you get the chance to go to the market in Washington, D.C., and Jody can talk about, you'll see. Lotta Reddy is a senior vice president for diversity, inclusion, and impact at Prudential. She sets the vision and strategy for the company's impact investment, philanthropy, corporate contributions, and employee engagement. She's a civil rights lawyer by training. I know a lot about Prudential because it's headquartered in my original hometown. I'm a working class kid. My dad worked in a factory. My mom took ads at the Star Ledger. But our next door neighbor, their son-in-law, was an executive at the Prudential. I knew that man as long as I was sentenced. And I talk in the book, I open the book with me experiencing the race riots in 1967 as a 10-year-old boy in Newark, New Jersey. It's what made me an urbanist. Well, lots of companies moved out. My father's eyeglass factory, where he worked, a victim of deindustrialization, shuttered. But Prudential stayed. And when you talk about a company that's made a difference, that's been really a definition, if you think of a definition of an anchor institution, Prudential is that definition. So Lotta, let's start with you. And maybe start with your own experience coming to Prudential, being part of the ongoing transformation of Newark. You know, it's nice finally to hear, and it's not just one story. There's been about 6 stories now about why Amazon should put its headquarters. You've probably seen them in Newark. I mean, that would have never happened a decade ago. So a little bit about your own story, but also tell us a little bit about what you've seen and been able to steward working with and for Prudential in Newark.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. You know, I first came to Prudential into Newark in 1997, fresh out of my then current role as a civil rights attorney, and was attracted to the company and the opportunity for a couple of reasons. One, right, the opportunity again to make a difference in a community that at that time certainly needed some help. And what I found was a company that had an incredible set of values, right, and operated from a sense of mission and purpose. And just a little bit of background on Prudential. It is what we would now call a purpose-built company. We were founded over 140 years ago in Newark, where we proudly remain headquartered. And we were founded to provide insurance to working families who at the time couldn't access insurance products. And that was because the prevailing belief was that they couldn't afford to pay the premiums or couldn't be trusted to pay the premiums. So pretty insidious, right, set of circumstances. But our founder, John Dryden, thought otherwise and created a business solution to this social problem. And with that, this product called industrial insurance was born. And that instilled a sense of purpose and an ethos in the company that exists right to this day, as evidenced by the fact, as Richard said, that we are still in Newark. And post the civil unrest 50 years ago, the leadership at the time made an affirmative decision to stay in the city, right? So, and not just to stay, but to take a leadership role in the revitalization of the city. And that's exactly what the company has done, and it's never looked back. And in fact, we've doubled down recently, just built a brand new office tower in the heart of downtown as another part of our commitment to the city. And so I say all that to say, again, somebody who's a civil rights attorney who came from the nonprofit and public sectors prior to the private sector, it was amazing to find a home like that at a company that believes so deeply in the role of business in driving progress, right, in addition to generating profits. And so that is, again, the place from which Prudential operates and the values that we still hold dear.
In the time you've been in Newark, it's hard to believe that was 50, that means I'm old. That was 50 years ago. I mean, when you said it, it was, I know it, but it was like, oh my God. It's been 50 years since Newark erupted in riots. It's a long time. In the time you've been in Newark, because I see it, you know, I see it, I see the change. How have you seen the change in that amount of time, and what may have been, at least in your estimation, in your words, what have been some of the drivers of that change? And maybe also not, where do you think Newark might need to go? Like, it's gotten from X to Y, but where does it need to go?
Yeah. So those of us who are engaged in development, right, in addition to economic growth, understand this is a long lead item. And so we've been at it for a while, again, right, for at least the last 50 years in a very concerted way, but even longer than that. And what we've seen is fits and starts. So there's a period, right, post the unrest where people were trying to make some serious investments to build the infrastructure back up and address the needs of the residents and the people of the community. And so, you know, they took hold, and there's some great things that came online. There's an affordable housing project that grew to be a solidly middle class and mixed income kind of community in the heart of the downtown where nobody had lived before. And some other office, you know, and other retail space that came online. But then there's sort of a lag. And so there were several years where, while there were investments being made, there wasn't a lot of visible kind of progress. That all changed about 5 years ago, and I think it has to do with the coalescing of a lot of different things. One is there seemed to be more interest, more regional interest from corporations and others, right? So a big inflow of capital that wasn't happening before. And we were thrilled, right, to welcome a lot of other partners in that regard. There was a set of leaders that came into the city, again, about 5 years ago. So John Schreiber at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, Nancy Cantor at Rutgers University Newark, and others, right, who are highly collaborative, highly mission-driven, again, individuals. And so, you know, working together, right, is the only way we're ever going to get this done. And so it was things like that, factors like that, you know, and then the subsidy regimes. I mean, there are a lot of very technical things, right, that had to be in place as well. But a coalition of the willing that quickly formed that was able to make things advance, you know, in a more accelerated way. And then once you began to develop a couple of proof points, it began to build from there.
Let's turn to you, Jody, and start at the micro level, and then we can go to macro, and talk a little bit about Washington, D.C., your home. Washington, D.C. is very different than Newark. It might be the polar opposite in many ways. It probably seen the greatest influx of a group that someone called, I don't know his name, the creative class, of any community. I think its share in the metro is something like 48%. It's some incredible number that is probably double what it is in Newark. It has seen waves of gentrification, parts of that community unrecognizable from what they were when I lived there a decade or so ago. You know, and when I met with Mayor Williams, both our good friends from Mayor Williams, he said, you know, Florida, God darn you, you gave us the playbook and you created all these problems for us because the rich people came in and the less advantaged people moved out. Of course, I said to Mayor Williams, you like my new book, but that's neither here nor there. But Washington, D.C. is sometimes held up as a poster child of some of the gentrification, affordability, and inequality of the new urban crisis. So tell us a little bit about your decision, a decade or so ago, to do what is an incredible project, really a leading edge project, the Union Market. And why you decided to do it, Jody, is important, and what you initially embarked on, because we talked at that time, and then how that vision, I don't want to say it's evolved, maybe that's too strong of a word, how as you've adapted to that community, as you've become a partner in investing in a community, that vision may have changed or evolved or broadened.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for having me here. So a couple of things important to know about DC. Everything you said is exactly right, but the things that we don't talk about in DC is that we still have a 20% illiteracy rate. So we have this very strong, highly educated, most educated city in the country. We are the highest household incomes in the country, in our region, but we in the city still have a 20% illiteracy rate. The other thing, about 10 years ago, there's two other really important factors because we have had this great influx of people into the city. Two things to note, though, is that first, people were coming into the city, 1,000 people a month, they were talking about every month, but nobody was talking about the people who were leaving the city. So we had a very high inflow, but we also had a very high people moving out of the city. And the people who were moving out of the city were people who were starting to form and build entrepreneurial businesses, and they were exiting. And the other thing that Eden's, we are, as Richard said, we're focused mostly on the ground level. So we are developers, we own about 120 projects. We do a lot of urban work, but we focus really on what happens on the first 20 feet. And there is $1 billion retail leakage out of the city. People who live in the city, people who are spending money, and so where was that going? So that really is where we started 10 years ago on Union Market, was looking for a place that could bring, we were following Richard, we thought he was brilliant with his creative class, who could bring the creatives and together, and not only want to bring them together to build community, but to scale and thrive in DC, and therefore help DC become really what it's on the cusp of becoming, which is a world-class city. And that's where we started. And that's how we found Union Market. We had invested in what's known as the Mount Vernon Triangle. The other thing I will say about DC is we deal with the height limit. So we knew that Northwest has sort of been built out. It had to grow in the city. But there was a reason that I think we missed initially, but maybe knew intuitively, which is that the creatives wanted to be around diversity. They wanted to be in a place, and placemaking really, truly matters. And it's hard to talk about, and we had to talk about what that meant. So we found Union Market. It had a lot of the aspects that any real estate developer likes, with transportation, with metro, things like that. But what we didn't realize until we got into it was the great institutions that brought diversity to our community, that therefore continued to add, and is really what's made the place so special and what's attracted to the place.
So talk a little bit about what you achieved. I mean, obviously you built out the market. You created this incredible experience. I mean, we've seen it on TV, profiled on TV news for food. And there's nothing wrong with chains. I'm not trying to, but local, an emphasis on local, an emphasis on good jobs, an emphasis on local entrepreneurship. When I was last at the facility, it was the day before the march, on the Women's March on Washington. I saw young artists in your room making, women from all over the country making these parachutes, which was unbelievable. And I met with a group of incredibly diverse local DCians, I mean, who'd come from every major brand and political organization, who were part of a nonprofit devoted to inclusion and diversity. The Gallaudet. I mean, we could go on and on. Why don't you talk a little bit about the neighborhood context and the other institutions, and how over this time you've been able to create something quite special, and where you might think the next steps will take it?
So overall, Union Market is 45 acres. Today on the ground, there's about 1 million square feet. The density will take it to about 8 million square feet. So when we started into this, and I never back away. We're capitalists. We're in the real estate business, so we care desperately. But we had to rethink everything we were doing and think about an ecosystem. Take a long-term approach to our investments, which is one of the biggest challenges right now. I think all real estate developers have is how do you take a long-term view with capital that is really incentivized for a short-term, faster investment cycle. So as we did this and we went into this area, we had to figure out how we were going to both retain and build up the community was there. So any new institution that came in, whether it was a business, whether it was a retail partner, we didn't let them into the cool kids club, which is what we got referred to a lot, unless they had on their own a willingness to give back. So when the #1 hair salon said, you know, I'm doing all the embassy women's hair, I'm doing all these people's hair, but want to open up on the cool street. We said, fine, how are you going to hold classes to build the next group of great cosmetologists that are here, and where are those jobs? How are we going to help them find jobs? And so we started to take this, and nobody said no to us, which we thought was really interesting. We kept waiting for people to say, no, I'm not going to do that. So we said, fine. And the other thing we committed to doing was helping entrepreneurs and matching them with capital. And I think a lot of us miss that. And we need an ecosystem. We need a system that's going to stay interesting. We want to get out of the cycles that we usually see in most of our places where you invest, where all of a sudden you take this rise up and then people move on to the next cool place. How do we even that out? So we have to continuously feed this ecosystem with diversity, with innovation, and with established institutions that can bring capital. And how do we give them a place that's interesting enough to naturally rub elbows? That happens over food, that happens over art, through conversation.
One more for you, Jody. You said 45 acres, was it 1 million square feet going to 8 million? Something like that. One of the things we're convinced here at the Urban Lab is this so-called, we'll give it a name, district model of development. That a lot of real estate is still done at the individual project or individual building level, but more and more developers want to do these districts. The Hudson Yards down the road, the Brooklyn Navy Yard are good examples of that. What Moishe Manna has done in Jersey City, or what he's doing in the Wynwood area, where Amazon is headquartered in Seattle, the South Lake Union District. I spent part of my time in Toronto. The 1,000 acres of waterfront, the rumored Sidewalk Labs project of Google, to be perhaps multiple 100 acres. So these district-scale developments are becoming increasingly popular and increasingly signature. A whole variety of reasons which we may want to talk about. But there is pushback. And you know, Uber was just kicked out of London. Bill de Blasio is saying in New York, we need more affordable housing. Eric Garcetti in LA is saying, we need better jobs and we need higher wages. Target just said that they're going to boost their own minimum wage voluntarily over the next X years. So there is pushback, and developers want things. They want more height. They want relaxation of zoning laws. In these district developments, many that I've heard, they want easier and more flexible regulation. They don't want the traditional. So there's room for negotiation. And as a developer and someone who said is capitalistic in that, we've actually written about this. Jody and I, Jody was kind enough to co-author kind of a big I'm big thing, but she brought the, you know, the real texture and on the ground enterprise to that for Harvard Business Review. How should, because this is a school of real estate, developers think about this idea of inclusion and being more inclusive, open to diversity, in thinking about not only these individual projects, but these district-like. Why is it important for real estate folks and developers to think about this?
I think it's incredibly important to think about it because we have a lot of times in these districts what I call the power of the pen. So we, back in 2006, 2007, worked directly with the community to come up with what we call the small area plan. And we knew we purposely didn't want to own all the real estate here. We were a little scared of ourselves that when one person controls, you can't help but become very monolithic. You can't help but, when everybody starts to look the same, it's boring, no matter what you do, right? And that what Jane Jacobs taught us. So we said what we do want to do, though, is we want to be really thoughtful, engaged with the community about where we all want to be in 20 years. And that's how far out we had to look. Little did we know it would actually take us a full 20 years to get there. But so we set a plan collectively, and I think that's really important. And it's a different mindset for a lot of us in development to really say, where do we want to be in 20 years? And what are the pitfalls that can come along the way? Because some of them look really sexy and they look really glamorous as you're getting there, but what are those pitfalls? So we laid out that immediately up front. And then we laid out a way to really think about what economic prosperity and what prosperity looked like with everybody who is there today and all the institutions that would come. And I think the advantage we had was nobody actually lived. We're a working market. We're a working food market. And so I think we knew that from the beginning. It was a huge benefit. And the 68 riots that happened in DC also caused Gallaudet, which is a great institutional partner of ours. It's the foremost hearing impaired institution in the country. They shut their doors. When the riots happened, they really became very insular and hadn't re-engaged with the community. And they were a really important partner to us to figure out how do we do that. So I think one of the biggest things is the developers can think up front. And if you have a good relationship with the municipalities and with the communities, I think it allows you to go into any investment knowing what to expect. I think where we have to work a little harder is where processes change along the way.
Latha, let's come back to you in the case of Newark. It's an interesting contrast. I think both of you are fascinating and interesting, but I don't think I truly appreciated the contrast between the work you do in such very different places until right now, here and now. And it actually makes this whole subject of inclusive prosperity much more interesting and balanced. DC is so far along the continuum of urban revival that its problem is no longer growth. It really is inclusion and equity. It has the highest incomes in the country. It has the highest level of human capital accumulation. It's trying to find places to accommodate everyone who wants to live there, and its housing prices are adjusting upward. Newark is at a very different place. It needs growth. I hate to say more, as much as it needs inclusion and equity, it needs investment and growth. It's in a fundamentally different place. And that's why we've had these separate conversations in the world of urban affairs. There have been groups of people concerned with growth, called economic developers, and groups of people concerned with equity, called community developers, or nonprofit associations dealing with poverty mitigation. Both very important missions, but the conversation's been siloed. And I don't want to lose track of that, because it's not just a conversation about the equity side of inclusion. It's how do we join those? And there's 2 new reports coming out from Brookings this week, tomorrow. We're going to write about at City Lab. But they use the words inclusive growth, and they're saying they're 2 sides of the same coin. You won't grow without inclusion, because you lose many of the assets. I'll talk about that another time. But you won't be inclusive without growth. The 2 go hand in hand. So that's where I wanted to come back to with Latha. How do you, in your own mind, or in Prudential's work, or as a representative and anchor, thinking about that strategy, think about, well, we have to have growth, we have to attract talent, we have to attract investment, but we have to do that in an inclusive fashion. How do you, in your own work, balance or try to think about or strategize about that combination?
Yeah, so we think about that all the time. And I'll quote Angela Glover-Blackwell, the CEO of PolicyLink, right, who talks about equity as the superior growth model. And we really believe that as well. We know that as a business to be a viable, right, ongoing entity, we need a talented workforce. We need consumers who understand and can navigate complex financial services and products and have the means to buy those products and services, right? We know that to attract the next generation of talent, we need to live up to our purpose. So there are a whole set of reasons and imperatives that make it necessary for us to understand this and quickly, come to terms with that. So it is definitely a balancing act. But we think the best way we can address it from both sides is by driving it through our business model. So Michael Porter, who was mentioned earlier, right, talks about shared value. So for us, everything emanates from that. As we look across our entire set of capabilities as a business, everything from our philanthropy, right, to our products and services and the expertise that we have in-house, right? How do we think about leveraging that for inclusive growth? And so, as Richard said, we have, and I was glad to hear the broader definition of an anchor institution, right? Because we sort of declared ourselves to be an anchor outside of the traditional definition of eds and meds. But I think a company that's been rooted in a community for 140 years can say that, we are in fact an anchor in that community. And anchors have a real role to play in inclusive growth, right? Because we are there, we own land, we employ people, we bring, people into the city every day. And how do we, who are spending money in the city? So we have a real ability to influence the economic growth part at the same time we think about the development part. And Newark is at an interesting moment in time because we're not DC, we're not there yet. But I'd say we're at a pivotal moment where we have to be very vigilant in terms of where we go next, right, and how we get there. And our mayor has talked about, and I thought this was sort of the perfect way to say it, is we can't be, so the phrase gentrification, right, we have a Whole Foods in Newark now. It opened several months ago. People hear that and they're like, oh, well, forget it, you guys are done, right? There goes any hope of being an inclusive community. But we think otherwise, right? Inclusion is about choice too. So we can't be so cynical that we say that those kinds of assets and those things are bad for a community, because at the same time Whole Foods came online, or a ShopRite had come online, and there were other amenities, right, that were brought online. So Newarkers, like everybody else, deserve choices and should be able to spend their money in the community, right, where they want to spend it. So it's finding that balance and also connecting people in place. And so, in the past, we had made parallel investments in the physical infrastructure and in the people part of it. What we realized is we need to, right, combine all of those resources, again, with our business capabilities to create inclusive growth.
I didn't know the ShopRite part. That's the store I grew up shopping at. That's so cool. And the Whole Foods thing is really interesting. When I lived in Pittsburgh, one of our most important community development battles and initiatives was about a Whole Foods. Our former mayor, who we both know, Tom Murphy, there was a Sears in East Liberty, a very highly impacted low-income community, where they foisted a horrific public housing project. I mean, it's just the worst of the worst. They built it over the highway, I mean, it's just horrible. And the community had really many issues. And then the idea was to build more roads through it, put a Home Depot in there. And they did get the Home Depot, but it's a big lot, a big box. And but the Community Development Corporation was brilliant. Oh my God. And they said, there was some, the target never came, but the idea they had was, a target doesn't have to be a big box. It could be a series of small, little storefront shops. Target loved the idea. They went to Target and they pitched the idea. Target, for a number of reasons, decided not to go there. But they were so smart, they said, Whole Foods doesn't have to be a gentrification trigger in our community. We could get Whole Foods to do two things. One, yeah, they can have all the yuppie stuff that yuppies like. That's fine. Who cares about that? But they could do two things. One, they could commit to employing local people, and they did. And two, they could commit to being a provider of whatever kind of food everybody in the neighborhood, yuppies and everybody else wanted, whatever. And Whole Foods agreed to both of those things. And what was so interesting, because it was actually there and it was beautiful, but when we would go shopping there, it would be not only a diverse workforce, but a diverse group of people. So it's very interesting. And I want to go back to this thing about anchors. First, thank you. Because we believe the definition, Stephen and I in our paper, we wrote you in. We believe that the definition of anchor is not only meds and eds, but includes large real estate investors and large corporations. And we think of the corporations who most importantly need to see themselves as anchors are obviously financial corporations, but big tech. If you look at the people who are really moving en masse into urban areas, think about Google's move. I shouldn't say its potential move into downtown San Jose around the transit hub. It's going to be a massive thing. Amazon in Seattle, the largest landholder, the largest employer, and Google in New York with the Port Authority. We could go on. So we believe, and many of these companies, and this is what I want you to get to, have been, rightly or wrongly, but mainly rightly seen as extractive. They go to the town. They like the town because it has a labor force and a labor pool and highly educated people. And they set up their campus. They don't even use the surrounding neighborhood shops. The hell with that. We're going to have a cafeteria. We're going to have a gymnasium. We're going to have a healthcare center. We're going to have a daycare center. And they use outsourced contractors. They pay the knowledge workers gold. And they give them all supplementary services. And oh, yeah, for that, for the janitorial services and the gymnasium, the health, we'll outsource that and pay them whatever the lowest possible. They've been seen as extractive, and people are mad. So one, I think it creates a constituency says no, but what I think is interesting about Prudential and your long road, so I want you to think about extractive versus investing, is the cost to a brand, sorry, from being extractive in the long run, and then maybe saying, on top of that, we'd like $1 billion of your tax and financial incentives. I forget what company said that. Oh, we'd like $1 billion of your tax and financial incentives to have us come and move to your town. It would seem to me that the value to brand, especially, financial companies, not all of them are held in high regard. You are. Maybe for 50 years that people said, well, Prudential's doing his do-goody things. Who knows why that matters? What do you think about this investment versus extraction? But importantly, how do you think being seen as a great corporate citizen, a great urban citizen, an investing anchor company might help your brand or other companies' brands?
It's interesting on that sort of latter point. So I came back to Prudential about 5 years ago in my current role, and we really revamped how we thought about and did what we call corporate social responsibility. And it's what I alluded to earlier. It's about embedding, right, a way of being throughout your entire business strategy and enterprise. And so, the way we talk about it now is CSR or purpose or whatever you want to call it, isn't how you spend the money you make, it's how you make your money. And so that to me is also the difference between being seen as extractive and being additive to a community. Because, people when I first started talking about it that way, people would say, won't people find that very cynical and say, well, you're just in it to make money on the backs of poor people, frankly, right? And I said, no, it's just the opposite. People actually get that, right? If I came in and said, I'm Prudential and we're a Fortune 50 company and we care about poor people, eyes are gonna roll, right? But if I say, we're Prudential, we've got a lot of assets that we can contribute to the greater common good, right, to help drive progress, and oh yes, it's good for our business, people actually understand that. And so, that orientation has been very helpful. But I think fundamentally it's about relationships and trust, right? And that's where the financial sector, we just obliterated that, right? And so we've reaped what we sow. Now, Prudential has been fortunate that our brand has, sort of stayed above the fray for various reasons. But, I'll give you one example. When we built our brand new tower, we thought very hard about how it would face off with the community, right? The literal physical structure. So versus, mitigating our security concerns, but we actually had a very open kind of campus, right? And so the steps lead out to the park that we rehabilitated several years ago, but it's very open so that when people walk by, they don't feel like it's been a walled off kind of, ivory tower. It's in fact part of the community. And Mayor Baraka himself has said that, that was actually the signal moment in Newark, in the most recent past of Newark that said to the world, Newark is open for business, right? Because there was a very visible kind of statement by a very prominent company that said, we are quite bullish on this city.
Jody, I want to turn back to you because of your candor and your intelligence. Now, we've talked about this, and you are an anchor, but you need the help of other anchors. You mentioned Gallaudet.
Absolutely.
But Gallaudet is an institution that is financially struggling. It's not a world-leading, well-financed, it's not NYU or the University of Toronto. I'm not talking about, it's not at that scale. It's not Harvard. It's not MIT. We talked about Johns Hopkins, you and I. If you could talk to other anchor institutions, other corporations, but let's talk about universities because we've talked about this. What could a university, how could these other anchor institutions from your experience as partners, Howard, we talked about the inclusive innovation center and incubator they're setting up. What could universities do, or other, I'm just using that, or medical centers or other anchors do as partners with you, with real estate developers, to make this process of inclusive prosperity better and to accelerate its happening?
So if we look long term and we talk about, one of the things I think that's helpful to frame this out is that Eden's about 10 years ago transitioned from having our sole purpose be to maximize shareholder return to enrich community. And in making that transition, what we did was we said, we're actually going to lay out a triple bottom line, which is a little bit overused, but we still have well-stated financial goals, and we have very well-stated operational goals, and we really lead and focus with our community and our social goals. And what we have found, and this leads into that partnership, is what we have found is when we lead and focus with those goals, we outperform our financial and our operational goals. And the reason for that is that our employee engagement surveys come in at like 93%. When we focus on these community goals, the community pays us back with their time, with their dwell time. And so, and as they're there, then all of our partners prosper more, whether they're our entrepreneurs, whether they're our retailers. So I think you said this earlier, but really, it is a good business model to be focused first and foremost on what is the community. So in hitting those community goals for Eden's, we've laid them out very clearly: their health, crime, education, and what we call opportunity. And we've been benchmarking those since 2012, 2011 in all of our centers. And we don't know what percent we get or what percent belongs to the schools that we partner with or what percent belongs to the other institutions that we partner with. But when we come together and we decide, because there's also a big divide between the business world and the non-for-profit world, and we don't rub elbows enough to know who we should be partnering with that can really help us accomplish a lot of those goals. So what do the universities do? What do the schools do? We do a lot of community events, and we're not really event planners, but we can use our canvases to bring in. We just partnered with the Smithsonian, the first time the Hirshhorn ever came out to the community to do anything outside their own four walls. Well, what happened as a result of it? As a result of it, Yoko Ono, who has 4.9 Twitter followers, pinned us on her front Twitter page. What does that mean? It means that when I ask for the sales report of all of our merchants around us, they go up that week exponentially. Why? I don't know. I guess there are a lot of Yoko Ono fans in Washington, D.C. But it's been this creative, because if we don't have engaging ground floors, it's where a lot of retail is, we don't have engaged communities. We are not rubbing elbows. And so how do we have an engaged ground floor that builds a community that decides more and more people want to live there, they want an office there? This is where people want to spend their time. When we talk about an ecosystem, I don't know where it starts and where it ends, but we have to think a lot well beyond just executing a lease. What we found is that's really cyclical. But when we can think longer term, we can think about how we create prosperity for everybody in that ecosystem. We all wind up outperforming.
I'll ask the same question to you because you have a big university partner, my alma mater. I'm a graduate of Rutgers University. I'm not saying Rutgers does this, I'm not saying NYU does this, but I've been at universities or worked at universities which think of themselves as gated communities. And will tell you that. You know where we're putting the new student center or this or that to block the neighborhood off. Or you look at the campus and it's literally walled off. We don't want our students going out. We want them to be in this little area. We've heard all of these stories. Universities are often the largest employer in their community. They pay their faculty well. Some, like this one, offer their faculty housing, affordable housing, housing supplements. Stanford provides mortgage support. Sometimes at some of these universities, they pay their cafeterias even worse than the big tech companies. They pay their janitorial service. They outsource a lot of that work as well. What are the dimensions on which universities, in general, not necessarily in Newark, but in general, universities can be better partners with other anchors in creating, and I don't want to leave out hospitals and medical centers because they also have big cafeterias and service workers, medical service workers. How could they be better partners in inclusion and prosperity?
So I will actually give a specific example about Rutgers Newark, but I think generally speaking, right, there's, and we've helped to work in Newark to form I might have mentioned this, a set of anchor institutions to come together under the auspices of what we're calling the Newark Anchor Collaborative. So there are 6 core members, Rutgers Newark being one of them, and hospitals and other institutions of higher ed as well. And then going beyond that to more, engage more stakeholders. But we thought these 6 are really highly committed, visible players, and so how can we all engage with each other, right, in a way that's meaningful? And what's great about it, and this speaks to your question, Richard, is that, because we are different institutions, we all bring different capabilities, right? And so for the universities, it's how are we looking at that pipeline of educated residents that they're creating, especially a university like Rutgers Newark, which I think is the most diverse campus in the country, and getting tremendous results with first-generation college goers and immigrants and the like. And so they're thinking about that talent pipeline they're feeding into, and they also are hiring people, right? They're an employer as well, and so how can they look at that? The hospital systems are looking at, right, they've got a range of jobs that they have online, and so they can hire people at various skills, right, with various skill sets at various levels of that education continuum, and so they're playing that role, right? We're a global financial services firm with our headquarters operation in Newark, so we need very different roles that we're trying to fill, and so, but there are other things that we can do as a player in this, right, and fund a lot of the infrastructure piece of the people in place. So just the specific example on Rutgers, right, we all, to demonstrate their commitment to that sort of, town and gown issue, and Nancy Cantor was known for this in Syracuse. Those of you who know Chancellor Cantor, she was the president of Syracuse University, and did a tremendous job there, breaking free of those boundaries of the campus, and wanted to do the same thing in Newark. And so we all partnered together, Prudential and L&M, our development partner, in redeveloping a major asset called the Haynes Building. It was a former department. Remember Haynes? So, right, people have such strong memories, right, of the Haynes Building. And this building was shut down for almost 40 years. And so an emotional and physical, reminder of the decline of the city, and a very painful one. And so we knew there was a huge opportunity to redevelop that asset, which is, again, is in the heart of the downtown. It's an 800,000 square foot building, so a huge footprint in the city. And so worked with L&M, which has been a tremendous partner of ours in the city, to redevelop that. And Rutgers was the first tenant. And they took, I think it was 50,000 square feet in the building to build out a lot of their community programs. Their Institute for Jazz Studies has standing exhibitions there. So they have done a tremendous amount of work, right, to bring themselves into the community. And this happens to be on a thoroughfare that connects the heart of downtown back to the university communities and some other sectors. So a visible part of, trying to create that walkable, thriving city.
You sent a really emotional connection, like a shiver up my spine when you said that. We used to shop at Haynes and Kresge's and Bamberger's when I was a little kid. I just remembered a boarded up building, and my mom's office at the Star Ledger ringed with barbed wire. What you've done is really, and I want to run an idea by you. You've probably already done this, but I want to run an idea by you because it's something that's come out of the work that Stephen and I and Ari have done. What do you think about the idea of an anchor's pledge? An anchor's pledge that we could say that all anchors put pressure on some of the less far-seeking ones. That all anchors would work for growth and development and do all the important things, make investments in community betterment, but also inclusion. And Jody and I have written about this along 3 planks. That they would work as institutions and with their tenants to make sure service workers have good jobs. Not just the uppy workers, that they have good jobs that provide family-supporting wages and a career path. And places like Prudential could help them understand how to do that. Secondly, that there was available workforce housing for everyone who worked in those institutions so they didn't have to commute an hour or 2 hours. And in addition to that, affordable housing for local neighborhood and communities residents. And thirdly, that you mentioned this, that the assets that would be created, open space, in the public domain, be transit, instead of private shuttle buses. You know, this gets people really angry, where they see free private shuttle buses taking rich people to and from work. Instead of that, public assets, publicly shared assets, from public parks to public transit. Could you see something like this, an anchor's pledge, being not just the eds and meds, but corporate actors, real estate actors? Is it something maybe you've discussed, I don't know if you have in Newark, is it something we could create some more national momentum in?
So we have thought about it and done it.
That's awesome.
Similar to what you've described, we frame it slightly differently. But so the basic, the notion is that, you know, we as a collective are committed to looking back within our own institutions and changing our behavior fundamentally, right? So, and it's around, for us, a three-pronged approach called buy local, hire local, live local. So, you know, how do we did some research actually with ICIC that was mentioned earlier to look at the business community in Newark, and we discovered that if collectively the anchor institutions just moved 10% of their procurement dollars to Newark, we would generate $33 million for Newark businesses. So, and that's just the low-hanging fruit, right, with the businesses that are currently capable of meeting our procurement needs. So it's acting out on things like that, right? So that's the buy. The live local is how do we create incentives for our employees, the employees of anchor institutions, to live in the city, to create the residential density that we need to support the amenities and the housing that's coming online. And then the hire local obviously speaks to the people of Newark, and how do we help provide the education and training infrastructure to prepare people for the jobs of today and the future.
So one last question for both of you. How do we help our high-tech companies from destroying themselves? I take Uber. It's not a well-liked company. It's got a real brand problem. My former chief of staff at the University of Toronto went to work for Airbnb to try to help them. They're not beloved by the communities in which they're there. They're seen as increasingly taking housing off the market and driving up prices. Our high-tech companies, you know, Frank Farrer's new book, who used to edit the New Republic, is all about the brand problems of our five most highly valued companies, the companies that spur innovation in this country, that make it competitive. People are mad, increasingly mad at. They protested those Google shuttle buses in San Francisco, and they wanted to have a ballot measure that said, no, we don't want any more tech. Can you imagine in America? And then, and I hate to put this on the spot, but it's current news. I'll use it as my example. You don't have to. Amazon comes along and says, you know what? We're outgrowing Seattle. It's getting expensive. Labor pool's thinning. We want to open up a second headquarters. And you know the way we're going to do this? We're going to set up an auction. We're going to set up an auction for 50 communities in the United States and Canada at a minimum cost of several $1 million each, just to organize a bid, to stand up and bid. And as a product of that bid, we'd like financial and tax incentives for you having the privilege to host Amazon. And of course, they said we're going to bring billions of dollars of investment in 50,000 jobs. When I mentioned this to 2,000 economic developers, the room went nuts. The room went nuts because they felt that a company was really pulling their strings. Now, I like Amazon, and I will say this. The largest share of my disposable income, for sure, goes to Amazon and Uber. But thank you. Jody just said that's unfortunate. I'm feeling guilty.
You should.
I'm not the only one who's feeling guilty. So this is the point I want you guys to address. How do we help them see this? Yeah, they've got our pocketbooks now. Yeah, they've got mine. I'm a pretty progressive thinker. They've got my pocketbook now, but people are saying this every day now. Why aren't I buying local like an anchor? Why aren't I going to my local shops? How can we reach out to these companies? Is there a way to make them become part of an Amazon pledge or a different kind of anchor's pledge? Is there a way to help them understand that they're part of a community, not just something that locates in a community and takes on? Jody, since you already interrupted me, let's start with you.
That's fine. I'll take it on, because I actually think the thought of 50,000 jobs in a city is a phenomenal thought. And I think what the power that Jeff Bezos has to put out that RFP, I think, speaks really strongly about the responsibility of all businesses and all CEOs that we have in this country and how people are responding to that. The counter, though, that I would say is last night when I arrived in New York, I realized I had forgotten my charger. So I had to stop at the Apple store, one of the highest valued company, one of the highest valued companies. So the one on the upper side was closed, so we came down, which I didn't want to do, but so I came down here, and it was, or to Central Park, it was incredible. This was 10 o'clock at night. It was packed on the ground floor and on the upstairs floor. People were in there to do things that they can't do online, which is they were in there to talk to people to gain intellect. They were in there to build communities. There were groups of people. They were all ages. This is Tuesday at 10 o'clock. All ages. They were old, they were young, they were socially, economically, everything you could ask, diversity, and very engaged with the employees of Apple, and therefore very engaged with the community of Apple, with the company, with the products, and they're doing something right because they're coming out of their four walls, they're coming out of their screens, and they're engaging in community. And so what's happening as a result of that, I don't think any of us even know where to measure those stats of what's happening. We can financially measure it, we can watch how they're growing, we can see what they're doing, but I keep going back to this human engagement, which is exactly what we're trying to figure out. Right now, our life, it is this barbell. It is the humanity of human beings balanced by AI. I mean, we're so far beyond e-commerce. We're embracing it. It's where we live. But how do we bring data and AI and the humanity of humans? So I think the biggest thing we could do, because I'd be a liar if I said I don't want 50,000 jobs in any one of the markets we operate in. And I think about all the things that will spur and all the creativity, but I want to have them out in the community. I want to have what we had at Apple last night. I think that more than anything else, and then that goes on to innovation in the schools, et cetera.
What do you think, Lata, as these companies either expand? Apple just built a new headquarters. It's not that open to the community, and it's been a backlash. And the highest property values in the United States, much higher than metropolitan New York, are in the Silicon Valley, where Apple and others are. Amazon has been an urban company. It has done very interesting things. They built a big homeless shelter in Seattle. It's done many good things. I don't mean to impugn them. But some of what it's doing with this RFP looks extractive. It doesn't look inclusive. How could these companies maybe learn from Prudential or others to be better? I mean, I think their test may be even higher because they're so big and so valuable, to be better urban citizens and better urban partners.
You know, I think the challenge, and I guess the hope with this Amazon RFP is, right, the challenge has been the loss of connection to place. I think we're one of the few companies that are headquartered in a city like Newark. So we have that deep tie and that deep connection. You know, I guess the hope with Amazon is that when they do move a place, however they get there and whatever benefits they get from that, that they will take that very seriously, right, and find that place and build that community and take that challenge on. I'm hearing that that's what their intent is, so I hope that happens. You know, so I'll give an example of a different tech company. It's smaller, but it is an Amazon company, actually, Audible.com, which is headquartered in Newark. Now, they moved their headquarters. Don Katz, the CEO, founder and CEO, moved the headquarters to Newark. They're building out a brand new headquarters facility there and really doubling down on their commitment to the city and trying to build a vibrant tech scene there, actually, smaller, right? But nonetheless, bring that industry in a positive way to contribute to the city.
You know, actually, I know Don as well, and I knew it was an Amazon company, but that is something very interesting that Amazon, through its acquisitions of Whole Foods, Zappos, Audible, has seen many different models of urbanism and has many to draw on. And you know, the RFP is crasser, I may add, having looked at both, than the Associated website. The Associated website is about Amazon being a committed company, but I do think it would be a very great thing if these tech companies now would position themselves honestly as being people who were not only looking at cities as places to get talent, to find a labor and talent pool, to have access to good transit, but also, as you said, to have a connection, a real connection to a place and invest in that place. Well, anyway, it's now time to hear from all of you. We have about 15 minutes or so for your questions. There's a microphone that you can see there. So I would say if you have a question, queue up at the microphone. So I would say head to the microphone, don't raise your hand. But the second thing is please, we like to use questions here. Our default is to go to cards. And the reason people go to past cards questions is because some people, not all of you, don't ask questions, they give speeches.
Oh.
So all I'm going to ask of you today is you may say who you are, where you're from, but ask us a question that our panelists can respond to.
Thanks for that. I'm totally going to ask a question.
Thank you.
I'm Tracy Lowe. I'm with the Center for Real Estate at George Washington University.
Oh, great.
And we've mostly talked about commercial real estate today, and it's been awesome to hear about the ways in which Edens and Prudential are investing in tenants and empowering them instead of just capitalizing on them. But we haven't really talked at all about what that looks like on the residential side. And that's a huge piece of the crisis that you talk about in your book, Dr. Florida. So I'm wondering if we could open it back up to the panel just to talk a little bit about what have your companies done, but also like what have you heard about happening on the residential side that you think inverts this more paternalistic model of capitalism and is something new and local and empowering.
I'm happy to field that. We do a lot of investing in affordable housing on many sides of our house at Prudential. And some of the things that get me excited and some of the things we're doing are around a holistic view to the opportunities that investing in affordable housing provides. So there's the obvious, right? The center of it is creating affordable housing for people to and their families to be stable and to stabilize communities. And there are two elements to that, right? It's sort of affordable housing where it is now and bringing affordable housing to communities of opportunity. And so, right, you're able to place people in places where they actually can thrive and grow and be successful. But the holistic view is around so we partner with an organization called Youth Build, which is, right, a nonprofit that trains young people who are not formally employed or in the education system in the construction trades. We have partnered them with our real estate investment business, which works with the largest developers in the world, who in turn work with the largest contractors, to create a glide path to employment for the Youth Build graduates. And then, how do we get them to work on these assets, right, that we're redeveloping, whether they're affordable housing or otherwise, frankly. And then how do we get underserved communities into the roles of managing these properties, right? So there's a whole kind of through line that you can create around that one asset class of affordable housing.
You're the first person I've ever heard utter the word workforce housing. You told me, like you were the first person who said, we need affordable housing and we need workforce housing. So on the resi side, Jody.
I don't think I coined that phrase at all, but
You told me.
all right. No, what I do, I focus a lot in Eden's. Part of our ecosystem is to make sure we have jobs, we have innovative jobs coming. And in retail, our labor force that fills our spaces every day typically can't afford to live. There's workforce housing. They need to live close by. And if they have to commute an hour and a half to come manage their store, to come wait tables, it's not going to happen. So to us, this focus on workforce housing is really important in a much broader ecosystem. And so there's always this balance between taking your short-term, what are we trying to drive, with this long-term view of how do we really build the longest, most sustainable communities. And so we're looking at balancing, we're looking at what does that mean? Should all the burden really fall just on the developers? Are there other things that work, that businesses and offices should be taking, whether that's pools that create funds for vouchers? There's all sorts of different ideas about this. It says it doesn't all just have to be burdened during a proffering situation, but how does a broader community really think about itself and make sure that its true workforce has the ability to be a very active part of the community?
I mean, Jody said the Jane Jacobs quote, right? When a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. The people, it's interesting, you know, I know 3 people looking for apartments in this neighborhood, 3 families. They are all in their 50s and 60s from other parts of the United States. They're all baby boomers that have accumulated equity in their homes and accumulated wealth. So neighborhoods require diversity at every scale. And you just can't have a neighborhood, if you want it to be an exciting and innovative neighborhood, it just can't be a neighborhood of people who are part-time residents in the equivalent of vertical gated communities. It just won't work. So we all have to commit to providing, and I mentioned it earlier, both workforce housing that is affordable and affordable housing for neighborhood residents. And I think Jody said it. I think here the real estate community should lead. And I think the way the real estate community should lead, and not just be a government process, is to say, look, we will build more, and we will build taller, and we will build denser. We'd like to do all those things, and if you give us the opportunity to do that, we will meet these social objectives. We will trade. We will trade things we want for things that we know make for a better city. And you already see it, you know, a lot. Now, it's not perfect, and affordable housing in New York is not necessarily housing for the truly disadvantaged, but you're already seeing 80-20 buildings happen all over this city, which are spectacularly beautiful buildings in which there is affordable housing and there is market rate housing. So I think there's a way to do this and to make it part of inclusive prosperity. That's what we all want, and you should be able to, if you want to build more and add density and build taller, you should be meeting some social objectives as well.
And I would just add, especially in a city like DC where the government really controls so much when you have a building height, if you could, in the right areas, just in the right areas, pierce that, think about the housing that could come from that.
Win, win, win. I hate to put it that way. Increase the density, build taller, and do it in a way.
Only in the right areas.
Now, of course, do it in a way with the right land use
of the
location. It doesn't destroy the historical and important character,
Right.
but it adds density, which powers more innovation. It adds affordability, which makes the community
Absolutely.
more affordable, and it allows you to grow in an inclusive
More
way. But that's the
interesting.
kind of win-win-win we need.
Absolutely.
Hey, good morning. My name's Andrew. I'm a student at Shack. My question for you guys is, how do investors view dollars spent on CSR and the impact it has on their IRR, as you guys are obviously advocating for, you know, more spend to CSR, and I'm sure there's people on the other side that are saying, you know, hey, this is impacting my returns. If you could talk about that. Thank you.
I'll let you answer this, but clearly we walk into it with financial objectives. I said this earlier, operational objectives, and then our community objectives. And so I think our investors have clearly defined what our financial objectives are, but I don't think we look at the two as not being totally linked together. They're not separate. So in order to accomplish those financial objectives, quite frankly, we outperform because of our community objectives that come along with them.
So I would just, same thing, maybe different spin, right? That we do believe that our goal of long-term value creation, right, for our stakeholders is dependent on our interaction with these societal issues. So, you know, we're at our heart an insurance company. We're in the long game, right? The business of making and keeping long-dated promises. We have to master the risk along the way, right? Our assets and liabilities matching. So we know that all of these various issues, whether immigration or climate or education, right, are going to impact us in the long term to be able to fulfill our promises. And so we have to keep our eye on the prize.
I just want to build on that. First, it's a great question, and I think it's the long game and a focus on a sustainable brand. I think that's it. Corporate social responsibility was the first wave of what we're talking about. It was kind of like the old days of environmental quality, where they said, put a scrubber on the end of the pipe. And then people said, no. If we empower work teams to think about innovations on the factory floor that make things cleaner and work with engineers, the whole process, it's like the early quality movement, where they said, oh, put in some quality inspectors there, and they'll fix the defects, and then you won't have a car that breaks. And then Japanese companies said, no, if we have the workers of the quality and work at the engineering departments, the whole thing will work, and it will become cleaner, leaner, greener, and more productive. I think you mentioned Mike Porter's concept of shared value. I think that's a more robust way of thinking about this. But I think this idea of inclusive prosperity suggests that by meeting these goals, you would have a brand that has much greater protection. And you would be seen as a brand that is something, because you know, people are getting fed up. And you know, they're getting fed up, and I hate to say it, the creative class is feeling guiltier and guiltier. You guilted me. Right here on stage, you guilted me. And we're very concerned about living in a society that treats people well and provides good jobs, you know, and you could imagine a good jobs pledge, like there was an environmental. We only make this thing by providing good jobs with our people. So I do think the long game about inclusion and shared value is about protecting and enhancing brand. You did, in Prudential, maybe for 50 years you did it because it was the right thing to do. And at the end of the 50 years, you wake up and all of a sudden, it's not just the right thing to do, it's created an incredible amount of brand value that other companies may have lost by doing the short-term thing.
Good morning, thank you. My name is John Salini, and I used to work at JP Morgan. My focus was real estate finance with more focus on affordable housing throughout the country. And today's topic is how can cities and the private sector work together, and yet today we do not have a member of a city government here to talk about their view. And by that, I'm concerned, Jody, that when you talk about a 20-year time frame for development and investment and opportunity, the political class or a politician who is elected and has 2 years to go is a short timer, making a decision for you and for the investment community. So how do we bridge that challenge in dealing with the approval process, which becomes so extended and so drawn out that it transcends a business cycle, and sometimes we almost forget why we are doing something? I was wondering if you could address the time value here.
Let me just start with very briefly saying we did invite a third panelist. It was Kathleen Wynne, the Premier of Ontario, who has the resources to make this happen and who has very quietly committed to inclusive prosperity. Her chief of staff is a woman named Mary Rowe, who lived between Toronto and New York, was a close friend of Jane Jacobs, ran the Municipal Art League. But Kathleen, as a premier, couldn't be here. So we decided that this conversation was better between the three of us. But we agree that we need people who really understand your question about the short and long run. Any other?
I would just say for us, I think for fortunate or unfortunate, election cycles have become a part of our business, and we understand that. And I think that we've decided that if we create successful places, if we create places that really build community where everybody is successful and hits prosperity, it's good for any elected official. And sometimes we've got caught up, I'll be honest, in political cycles, but we've put our head down and we've stayed true to our own mission. And I think that's all you can do. I really believe in that. And I believe, though, that we need to communicate up front, make sure that we at least go into projects on the same page with aligned interests. And from time to time, you do get caught. It's part of one of our risks that we look at when we look at risk and return. It's that political cycle.
I'd like to hear you, Lata. I don't want you to even have to say this, so I will say this. Until the recent turn towards good government in Newark arguably was not a really well-governed city. I remember the Italian-American mayors of Newark. You wouldn't know them, but I think several of them ended up doing hard time. And there was a long stretch in Newark that it wasn't well-governed. But you've been there for a long time and made it work. So.
Yes, and having said that, I would agree with Jody. I think a lot of it is just, right, you've got to keep your eye on the prize and stay the course, build those relationships, and understand that at various points in time, it usually is around that 2-year mark, and right, where the pressure begins to build because they're looking at re-election and what that means. But to Richard's point, we worked with Mayor Sharp James, who was in office for 20 years, with Mayor Booker when he was the mayor of Newark, and now with Mayor Baraka. And especially in that last handoff of change of administrations, it was seamless, right? And so the projects that were begun under Mayor Booker's administration have now finished and are, some being completed under Mayor Baraka. So it gives me hope.
You have the last word.
Thank you. My name is Casey Chalonsik. I'm from Jimdale USA, a real estate development firm here in New York. My question is, I want to go back to the Amazon topic, and I attended your last panel on the Creative Plus. And the words that came out is extractive, but what do you think Amazon wants in a city, and which city do you think, to any of the panelists, Amazon would love to be located?
I think we collectively represent 3 places that have been shortlisted or parts of shortlist. On my own shortlist, I placed Washington, D.C. as first. You could look at my Twitter feed and see why. Other people, I live between New York and Toronto. Other people have put Toronto very high on the list. One economic developer said to me, if Jeff Bezos really wanted to send a message to the United States, he'd let 50 communities compete, show what they got, and put it in a Canadian city, and it would send a message to Washington, D.C. I don't believe he will do that, but it was a funny comment. But many people have mentioned not only the New York metropolitan area with its scale and many sites ready, but Newark. I mean, Newark has been a place that I've seen 3 or 4 commentaries talk about. So maybe you guys would, I don't know, you could handicap this better than me. I don't think it's more than half dozen cities that really have, metropolitan area cities, metropolitan areas that have a shot. They need a big airport, they need a big labor pool, they need great universities, but I don't know, what do you guys think? Any ideas?
I think the best part of this, we're invested in almost every major East Coast, Houston and Dallas as well, and have an office in Denver. So all of the cities in which we are invested are really, I think this has been a great exercise. I agree with Richard, a little bit of it. There's a little drama around it, but I think it's been a great exercise for every one of these cities to look inside and say, wait a second. First, what makes this really great, and let's sell. But they've all said, wow, we're going to spend a lot of money and we might not land this. Why not? Why not? And those questions of the why not, as this is going on, I think is incredibly important. And I think our cities right now, at least the 4 or 5 that we're involved with, have this great opportunity to actually be true to themselves and say, why not? And what can we do to fix that? So when the next audible.com, there are going to be a lot more businesses coming out. How do we make sure we do land those if we don't land this one? So yeah, I agree a little bit with Richard, but not really. I think this has been a great exercise for our cities to go through.
I would agree that on that last point, it's an interesting exercise, right? Because what it does, I hope, is in some ways flip the narrative, right? So that's from an asset-based perspective, right? People think about Newark, they're like, Newark, really, Amazon? But Newark's got 5 major universities and colleges, right? Major transportation nodes.
Those?
Exactly. How do people know about it, and how do we think about that from a business attraction?
So 2 things to wrap up. 2 things to wrap up. One, I've been working with a lot of communities on this. I say almost exactly what you have said. First, look at this as a community building process to array your assets and to think about your shortcomings. If you're a smaller community that doesn't have that hub airport, that's telling you something. If you're a bigger community that doesn't have housing inventory or affordability, that's telling you something. And look at it as ability to build community process and be unified, not say my city has a better site than your city and complain at one another. 2, think about this as a way of getting to know Amazon. Amazon has the best site selection team in the world, and they not only cite a headquarters, they cite distribution and logistics and research facilities and offices all the time. Date Amazon and get to know them. And 3, do not load up financial incentives. Think about your place-based assets, and if you're going to load up incentives, do things like invest in education and training programs which will build your talent pool. Invest in thinking about your transit. Don't just go there with a blank check. If they're saying what are financial, think about them as place-based assets that can be claimed as incentives. Look, what heartens me is we spent the last 20 or 30, 40 years bringing cities and communities back. Washington, D.C. is maybe a poster child of that, and now Newark, my own hometown, has achieved some level of critical mass. If we can do that, we can create inclusive prosperity. Once we've created the growth and the economic dynamism and the revival and the people who want to come back, actually turning that corner, and I think that too, you guys both said long game, I think that too is a long game. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But if we can shift the conversation from growth versus affordability back to something that says we're going to do these things together, that growth requires inclusiveness and affordability and equity, I think over the next 10 to 15 years, we'll get there. And I think in many ways, it's the most exciting time to be part of the real estate and urban development community. I'd like to thank all of you, and love to thank our panelists. And over to you, Steve.